Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to continue our discussion of changes in the 19th century. We've already discussed the rise of industrialism and capital, changes in transportation, and increasing social mobility. All right, so let's pick up where we left off. The next thing we're going to talk about is urbanization. And this is very much related to the last thing we were talking about, social mobility. But not only were people moving around, but in particular, people were moving from more rural areas to big cities. And as we'll talk about also, immigrants were tending to come to big cities in ever increasing numbers. Okay. I talked about it in our Benjamin Franklin unit that when we think of American cities in the colonial era and the early republic, the names are familiar and sound like grand, great, large cities. New York, Boston, Philadelphia. But I told you in terms of older European cities of the time, these relatively new American cities were tiny. Benjamin Franklin left a Boston that had a population of about 12,000 people and moved to Philadelphia to a population that was around 6,000 people. Right? At the same time, Paris had over 600,000 people. London had more than 500,000 people. So, today we think of these cities as all being rather similar and equivalent, but in the 18th century, in the early 19th century, there's no comparison. Okay, these were tiny places. But it's in the 1800s, in the 19th century, especially the second half of the 1800s, that this really starts to change. I mean, the great example of this, but this is typical of a lot of big cities on the East Coast, had these kinds of growth rates. But look at this next slide. Okay, this is a population chart of New York City by decade. So 1800. Okay, New York City had 60,000 people in 1800. Okay, look down to 1900 and look at the population in 1900. 3.8 million people. From 60,000 to 3.8 million in 100 years. You don't think that's a lot of change? You don't think people are going to have to grapple with this tremendous change that's going on? Okay, by the way, I just threw this in because it's interesting. Look at the next decade. Between 1900 and 1910, 6 million. The population almost doubles in a decade. I'll talk about in a second when we talk about immigration what accounted for a big chunk of that. But look, you could even think of this in contemporary terms, okay? Go to a city that has a population of 60,000 people. By the way, that's smaller than Fullerton. That's probably half of the population of Fullerton. Okay, go to a city with about 60,000 people, and then go to a city with 3 million people. Okay, light and day difference between those two experiences. Now, remember, last lecture I started by saying that there was a lot of change in the 19th century, and there was a lot of change in the 20th century. But by the 20th century, people were expecting change, and it made it less shocking. People in the 19th century were not prepared for the rate of change. Okay? Look, between 1900 and the year 2000, the population of New York moved from about 3.8 million to over 8 million. Okay? Look, in terms of numbers, that's a huge jump, right? Almost 150%. But in terms of the feel, again, go to a city with, 3 million people in it, and then go to a city that has 8 million people. You might not even tell the difference. You might not even be able to know which one had the bigger population, depending on how the city is laid out, right? San Francisco has a population of about 900,000 people. Los Angeles has a population of 4 million people. Way more people in LA than San Francisco. But if you go, if you're in downtown San Francisco and you're in downtown Los Angeles, you might not be able to really tell one of these cities is much bigger than the other. Okay. But go to a city with 60,000 people and then go to a city with 3 million people. Light and day. It's a different world that we're talking about. And that change is happening in the 1800s. Okay. So this tremendous urbanization is happening, and it's just transforming ways of life. Now, in your book that we're reading, Haltunen talks about this idea of a world of strangers. Increasingly, Victorians were going to come to live in a world of strangers. And it's such a wonderful way of thinking about modern urban life. Go back to our Puritan friends in Denham. They lived in this tiny little village, and we talked about how terrified they were of strangers and how they so much wanted to avoid strangers. They wanted to know everybody. They organized their land initially to force interaction, to create you can almost think of it as a kind of intimacy between town members. That's what they wanted. But as we get into the Victorian era, and especially as the Victorian era moves on by decades, increasingly people are leaving little farming villages and coming to large urban areas. And increasingly, they don't know the vast, vast majority of people that they live with. They walk down crowded streets. They don't know these people. These people are strangers. We live in a world of strangers. Okay. Think of a typical day when you can someday come to campus at Cal State Fullerton, right? And you leave your home, you take some sort of transportation, or if you don't live on campus, take some sort of transportation to get there. You drive down roads, you sit on a bus surrounded by people that you don't know, see cars whizzing past you of people you don't know. Get onto campus, the vast majority of people you do not know. You walk into classrooms, unless it's some sort of very small class. There are probably lots of strangers in that class to you. You go to eat on campus, lots of strangers you were surrounded by while you were eating, and so on and so forth. Right? This would have been a world very unfamiliar and very frightening to the Puritans. Very frightening to the Puritans. Okay. It's a world Benjamin Franklin would have adapted to pretty quick. He grew up in Boston, and 6,000 people or 12,000 people when he left Boston wasn't a lot of people, but that's still a lot of strangers. Ben Franklin did not know most of the people he saw walking around every day. But increasingly, it's the world that the Victorians are going to have to deal with. And so we're going to talk a lot about this idea of a world of strangers, because on the one hand, the Victorians are going to like the opportunity and the possibilities of large urban environments. On the other hand, they're still going to have some of this fear that the Puritans had about strangers. How do you trust strangers? When you meet a stranger, how do you know if they mean you well or mean you ill? How can you tell? And so urbanization is going to be a big factor in this world of strangers that we're going to talk a lot about as we continue on here. All right, let's go to our next issue. Immigration. Okay. A big chunk of that increase in urbanization, not all of it, but a big chunk of it, is going to be coming from immigration. Okay. Prior to the 1850s, the United States had a fair amount of immigration, especially compared to other countries. Compared to other countries, the United States had tremendous immigration. But it really starts to accelerate in the second half of the 1800s. And as we'll talk about after I talk about these numbers, the type of people coming to America is going to change. And this is going to be an issue that the Victorians are going to grapple with. So here I have some of these numbers by decade to give you a sense of the scope. Okay, let me give you a baseline number to give you a sense of scale for what we're talking about. In 1776, when the United States was founded, in the whole country, there were 3 million people. In the whole country, 3 million people. Okay, so that gives you some sense of how many people are starting to come by decade here. All right. So in the 1860s, where we'll start, 2 million people came, all right, in that decade alone. 1870s, that number jumps up to 2.7. Okay. 1880s, dramatic rise, 5.5 million in that decade alone. Okay. In the 1890s, there's a drop. That number goes down to 3.6 million. In the middle of the 1890s, the United States was mired in its worst depression in the nation's history. To that point, the Great Depression of the 1930s will be worse, but up until that point, the depression of the mid-1890s was the worst in American history. And that tells you something. Even when the United States was mired in this really bad depression, there were still more than 3.5 million people that said, we want to move there. Look at the first decade of the 20th century. We described the first decade of a new century as the aughts. The aughts. A lot of you should know that. A lot of you were born in the aughts, in the 21st century. My son was born in '04. My daughter was born in '06. The aughts had tremendous growth. 9 million people came in that one decade alone. Almost 1 million people a year were coming in. Okay. Remember when we looked at our chart for New York City and that dramatic jump in population from 1900 to 1910? Okay. Now you know why. A big chunk of that were immigrants coming in during that decade. Of those 9 million immigrants that came, a sizable chunk, certainly not all of them, but obviously a sizable chunk went to New York City. Right? Tremendous. Last decade, we'll talk about the 1910s, the teens, 4.5 million. Once again, that number's down, but there's a factor going on. World War I was going on. That made getting across the Atlantic, which would have been most of these immigrants, was a lot tougher for a big chunk of that decade. So that number's down a bit. Okay, so just tremendous numbers of people. And by the way, in all of these decades we're talking about, there were no restrictions placed on immigration coming into the country. Okay, you didn't need passports, you didn't need green cards, you didn't need visas. There were no work permits that were going on. There were some restrictions on citizenship applied towards people of Asian and Pacific Islander ancestry. We won't talk about that so much specifically, but I just wanted to point that out. There were restrictions on citizenship that would come in. But just tremendous numbers. So the kind of debates we are having today about immigration are nothing new in American history. Nothing new. You don't think Americans were freaking out when 9 million people arrived in one decade? The beginning of the 20th century? Of course some people were freaking out about that. So there have always been these debates that we've had as Americans. There's nothing new about it. Part of the heat and drama of contemporary debates about immigration seem to be people that don't know their history very well, and this sense that somehow what's happening in America recently is unprecedented, but it's frankly not unprecedented. Immigration has always been an issue, and it's always been something that's been debated. in American history. But so not only did you have this quantitative dimension to immigration at the time, where there's just lots of numbers of people, but increasingly immigrants were coming from different places. Prior to the 1870s, most immigrants coming to the United States were coming from Northern and Western Europe, countries like England, Germany, Scandinavian countries. And a large bulk of these people, certainly not all of them, but a significant majority of them were coming from Protestant backgrounds. Okay? Lots of Protestant people. And this was the sort of preferred religious outlook of Americans for so long in American history. Protestant Americans. Yeah. But particularly after the 1870s, you get an increasing number of immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And also a small but significant increase in people coming from Asia. Okay, particularly concentrated for Asian immigrants on the West Coast in California and some of the West Coast states. Relatively small compared to the numbers we're talking about, but significant, right? Because of their growing numbers on the West Coast. Okay. Not only did you get a lot of Southern and Eastern Europeans coming, Italians, Greeks, Poles, Russians, Slavs, Jews that were coming, but also coming with an increasingly diverse religious profile. Lots of Catholics, lots of Jews, lots of Eastern Orthodox Christians coming in. And so for native-born Americans, often from Protestant backgrounds, think of the descendants of our old Puritan friends in Massachusetts. As you get these increasing millions of people coming, they're also coming from different religious and cultural backgrounds. Okay? More Catholics, more Jews, more Eastern Orthodox. These were religions that Protestants tended to look down upon, that tended to think of less than. There were many ethnic groups coming from these Southern and Eastern European countries that were looked down upon. Jews, Italians, Slavs. And this was going to be an increasing issue of tension and concern. Again, this contemporary debate over immigration, often animated by the sense that these people coming now seem to be different than people that used to come, or that these people that are coming can't or won't assimilate. There's nothing new about this debate. Going back into the 18th century, into the 19th century, there were always native-born Americans that were looking at these new immigrants from different places going, no, their religion is weird. They're an inferior ethnic group. They're not like us. They don't want to become us. They don't want to learn our language. Oh my goodness. This idea that immigrants today don't want to learn to speak English is so laughable. Lots of generations of Americans or immigrants coming struggled with learning English. English is a very difficult language to learn. Go to the library. Go to a good research library like we have at Cal State Fullerton and look up non-English language newspapers that were published in the United States going back through history. You'll find them in Yiddish and Dutch and German, in Russian, in Greek, in Polish, in Spanish, in Japanese, in Chinese. If all of these people, the first day they got off the boat, learned how to speak English back in the good old days, why so many of these newspapers that were published in native languages. All right? There's nothing new about these debates that we're having today. Very familiar, very familiar. And not only did these people, have different religious backgrounds, they had different cultural backgrounds. For example, one of the things we'll maybe talk about more is as we get into the later Victorian era, this push to abolish alcohol in America that will eventually lead, it started as this temperance movement, will eventually progress to the prohibition of the 1920s and early 1930s. That didn't come out of nowhere just suddenly in the 1920s. That was a long effort, mostly animated by Protestant evangelical Christianity, to bar alcohol and its consumption in the United States. This argument against alcohol is very much part of a Protestant tradition. Not all Protestants, but where you look at the idea of alcohol being wrong and evil, it mostly comes out of Protestant traditions. Catholics, Jews, Eastern Orthodox, they don't have any prescriptions against the reasonable consumption of alcohol. They all have prohibitions against repeated drunkenness. That's not okay. But for Jews, for Catholics, for Eastern Orthodox, if you want to have an occasional drink, that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing evil about that as far as these faiths are concerned. After all, Christ did turn water into wine in the Bible. It's okay. But there develops a Protestant interpretation of Christianity that starts to see any consumption of alcohol as being evil. So at the same time, you have more Protestants, particularly Protestant women, working to abolish alcohol in the United States. You're getting more and more immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, many of them Catholic and Jewish and Eastern Orthodox, coming from cultures in which consumption of alcohol is accepted and fine and no problem. We're going to see clashes between native-born Americans and increasingly these immigrants that are coming. Okay. All right, last thing we're going to talk about in terms of change is changing politics. Okay. Remember when we were debating the idea of was Denham a democracy? And we said, while Denham did have certain characteristics of democratic practice, for example, voting, can't really call Denham a democracy because they didn't really embrace an idea of representation. Once voted into office, for example, members of the select board were not expected to pay attention to the will of the people. Rather, they were elected by voting, and then once in office, they were going to follow their own will and their own consciousness and their own good judgment to determine what is needed for the people. And I told you that we describe that sense of politics as a deferential style of politics. By the time we start getting into the 1820s, that sense of deferential politics is starting to evaporate, and it's being replaced by mass politics. By the 1820s, and we really associate this with the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828. One of the things that happens in the 1820s is universal white male voting rights are installed in the United States. Prior to the 1820s, you not only had to be white, you not only had to be male, but you also had to possess a certain amount of taxable property. We talked about changing voting rights back in Denham, and sometimes in Denham, you needed to have a certain amount of taxable property. The idea behind this was we want to eliminate dumb, lazy voters. Very bigoted attitude, but that was the idea, that unless you are together enough to own some property, to have a stake in the city, the state, or the nation, you don't get to vote. In the 1820s, that requirement was dropped, which dramatically increased the possibility of poor white men and poor working class men being able to vote in elections. And Andrew Jackson was the presidential candidate that really tried to appeal to these new poor and working class voters. And what Jackson tried to argue was that I am not better than you. I am one of you. I am the same as you. And therefore, if you elect me as president, I will follow the will of the people. I will follow you. Notice that idea of deference is gone with this. Jackson isn't saying, hey, you should vote for me because I'm better than you, I'm smarter, I'm wiser than you. And when I get into office, I will use my greater wisdom to do what is good for you. No. Jackson says, no, I am like you. I'm one of you. I understand your wants and your needs, and therefore you should elect me because once I get into office, I will do what you want me to do. Right? I am of the people. Okay? This is a very different mentality when it comes to elected officials. Okay? And again, going back to that native-born middle class, that native-born middle class had always been able to vote. If you were considered middle class at the end of the 1700s into the 1800s, that meant you owned enough taxable property to always be able to vote. These were the people that were always able to vote, the people that we're going to profile as Victorians. It's the poor and the working class in the Victorian era that are now starting to be able to vote. And so our Victorian friends are going to be very disturbed by this. Oh my God. The unwashed masses are starting to vote. And they're going to make bad decisions. And not only are they going to make bad decisions, but they are going to vote the wrong people into office. And those people in office are going to cater to the wishes and demands of the uneducated masses. By the way, I'm not saying this is true. This was middle class fear of what was going to happen. So this is going to be another area of concern, a big change, a change in the mentality of politics, a politics in which the poor white working class, at least male, and also poor white men are going to have a much greater influence on politics. And for the middle class, for many of them, this is going to be increasingly disturbing and worrisome. Okay. Those are the big changes going on in the 1800s. Now, when we start talking about Victorianism, what were their beliefs? What were their values? You're better going to understand what those beliefs and values are because you're going to better understand what they were responding. You're going to understand the historical context better, so it's going to make more sense. It doesn't mean you're going to agree with their decisions and their beliefs and values, but you can understand historically why some of these ideas that we associate with Victorianism were attracted to these people. Okay? All right, so that's it for this lecture. All right, I'll see you guys next time.